I'm Anwar Sheikh. I'm a professor of economics and chairman of the economics department of the New School for Social Research in New York. I am here at invitation of the National University at the Curry Conference, and I work on a variety of subjects, including international trade, globalization, inequality, crises, and the foundations of economic analysis. I've been working on these issues for a long time, and I'm interested in how to go from general principles to the actual analysis of actual countries. Recently, I've completed a book after 15 years of work, which tries to lay the ideas that I've worked on in one systematic place. And the goal of the book is to provide an alternate foundation for economic analysis, an alternate to orthodox economics, which is neoclassical economics, and also an alternative to heterodox economics insofar as it depends on post-Keynesian and structuralist economics. By an alternative, I mean a third way to proceed that can go from foundations all the way down to actual analysis. The name of the book is called Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, Crises. And this is the book cover, which I hope you can see. It's going to come out from Oxford University Press in February. It's a big book because it covers all the steps in economic analysis from the very basic issues of microeconomics down to the most concrete issues of the current crisis in the developed capitalist world. One of the things that I'm most interested in is how a system like capitalism, which changes so much over time, whose institutions change, whose laws change, whose policies change, whose interest in particular things in commodities and fashions change, can still exhibit patterns that repeat themselves over hundreds of years. Now, when you look at these patterns, as I do in my book, a question immediately arises. How can there be patterns that are similar if the system keeps changing? And the answer is the change is at a certain level, but the fundamentals of the system don't change. For instance, a capitalist country is always still dominated by profit motives because businesses are the dominant sphere. So governments have to stay within the limits of that. Wages come from employment, but employment is based on the possibility of hiring people to make profit. So consumption comes from wages. Investment comes from the prospect of more profit. So investment comes from profit. So then aggregate demand comes from profit. Once you begin to understand that and you look at it not just theoretically but empirically, it becomes more sensible to see that there are patterns of roughly crises in capitalism between 40 and 50 years repeating themselves, and one can show this empirically. And more interestingly, the current global crisis, which began in 2007, was more or less on schedule. In my courses, I used to show these charts of the waves, and by 2003, I was telling my students, look, if these things repeat, then you would expect a new crisis around 2008, 2009. I was wrong. The crisis came in 2007, 2008. But considering the casual way in which I was doing this empirical projection, it is remarkable how accurate that is. And that tells us something also about the future, because if these patterns hold, we would expect to see another boom and another top and then another downturn and then another crisis of some sort, which will be expressed on a global scale. Another similar issue I'm interested in is inequality. There's been much discussion about Piketty now, and Piketty has shown in his wonderful empirical work how inequality is an intrinsic feature of capitalism over its whole history of hundreds and hundreds of years. But that doesn't tell you exactly where it comes from, and he himself divides inequality into two parts: inequality among wage earners, salary earners, and inequality among property earners. One of the things I lectured on today at the university was to show how you can explain this kind of inequality from a theoretical perspective and show how that theory anticipates certain patterns, and we can find those patterns and confirm the theoretical argument, which is to say that capitalism has distributions of wage income, distributions of profit income, and then the balance of power between profits and wages and between financial and production capital is what determines the final distribution. Now again, this is an important issue because there's some room to maneuver in these things, but there are also quite strict limits. You can only drive profits down so far or wages up so far. You can only raise or lower financial capital so far. And so that explains, again, why the patterns repeat themselves. The third issue, which I'm very interested in, is orthodox economics portrays individual behavior in a way that I think is bizarre. It portrays individuals as these little machines that act with perfect information and perfect knowledge of everything to make absolutely perfect decisions. Now, I don't know how anybody can sit in a class of microeconomics and believe that, at least at first, because it's so obvious that this is not how we live and how we operate. So one of my interests is to try and show that we can start from a different foundation, a foundation in which we can look at how people really behave, and then we can still explain all the things that orthodox economics explains in terms of demand and supply without having to rely on these fantasy assumptions about behavior. And that leads me to the last point, which is how come orthodox economics makes these assumptions? And the answer is because these assumptions give you a picture of capitalism, which is an ideal, efficient, harmonious social system, and then you try to push everybody to fit onto these assumptions. And I say that we should proceed the opposite way. We should proceed as Darwin would, or Einstein would, or Smith and Ricardo and Marx, or Keynes and Kalecki would, which is to look at the real world, see how it works, and develop our theory from that basis so that we are connected to it all the way through.